So with that, I'm going to lead off with the first panel, talking about healthy watersheds. We have three exceptional panelists here. We have David Grant, the Global Sustainability Director for PepsiCo, Professor Angela Ortigara, Water Stewardship Manager for WWF, and Andre Fourie, the Global VP for Sustainability at ABInBev. And before I pitch some questions to the group and get us going and warmed up here, I just want to read two things. And what I love about this is that how different companies are framing what healthy watersheds are. And that's important because it's different for every industry sector. It's different for every company within an industry sector. And I love the diversity of thinking in terms of what is a healthy watershed and how do we get there. So I'll start with ABInBev. They talk about building watershed health. And Andre, of course, correct me if I get this wrong. I know you will. 100% of our communities in high stress areas will have measurably improved water availability and quality by 2025. Key words, measurably improved. PepsiCo, David, water positive, achieve sustainable water security for our business, natural ecosystems, and local communities that depend on an accessible and reliable supply of clean and safe water. So guys, did I get these right? Not approvingly, thank you, I appreciate it. So I want to start with the obvious question, and for me, you know, being on the outside here, it just strikes me that the notion of a healthy watershed is something relatively new. I believe multinationals have all been engaged in collective action in watersheds and so on. But why the increased focus on this as a way to really propel water stewardship, water strategy programs? And I'm going to start with Angela first on this, because Angela, you are experienced, well-versed, authoritative, and work with both of these organizations. So what's your take on why now?
Thank you. So there are many ways to see it. One is that people start taking serious that water is life. And so that is like companies are translating that into understanding that for them to operate properly, they need to have a healthy watershed. It's something that we in the water sector have been talking all the time and for years. But now that climate change is around the corner and we are seeing that water is the way climate change manifests, companies are really growing their interest in having this water health and watershed health because it affects their financial materiality. Other thing that I believe is really helping to happen right now is communication, social media, accountability. So NGOs, local stakeholders, investors, they are seeing the impacts of climate change, the impacts of unhealthy watersheds in their lives. And so they are asking companies to be accountable on their supply chains, on their operations. And then companies are really taking it on, and some of them are really doing a good job.
Angela, in part, do you believe the construct of a healthy watershed honors that water is ultimately always a local issue? So making it local, personal, connecting not just multinationals and NGOs, but the public sector and civil society. Is that part of the reason we're using this this term of art, so to speak?
So I think that like all the problems that we face, I mean, we can see a drought or something happening far away, but now we are seeing climate change happening right now, and it is reflected in water, like being that it's too dry or it's raining too much, we are seeing it now. And we are understanding that everything we buy, everything we use has a water impact. It's impacting the climate and the planet somehow. So it's like we are understanding that our actions right now are having an impact, and we are asking companies to help us to reduce our impact through their actions, because they have a leverage that, like, they have power to make changes that us consumers are not alone. I'm talking now from a consumer's perspective, yes.
Well, we're all consumers in some way, right? And it also seems that there's an increased drive on the utility side to really engage more proactively, not just at the watershed level, because we know water doesn't come from the tap, but also to work collaboratively with multinationals and NGOs on creating and sustaining these healthy watersheds.
Yes, something that we are doing at WWF that I think it's a good example of collective action. I'm going to talk about one example in India, the Noyal Bhavani. So we had a plan for this basin, and in this basin there was the Noyal Bhavani is in South India, and it has a textile hub called Tirupur. So we developed the plan for the whole basin, and we got these textile companies, international companies, helping us to implement not only the work with their suppliers on ground, but the work through the whole basin. So we are working in that basin in biogeophysical mapping to understand groundwater, water pollution hotspots. We are doing restoration projects for wetlands in that region. We are also working with invasive species, and that's all through this funding from these textile companies, but they are really helping the community to understand the importance of water, and they are helping us as WWF to achieve what we call the healthy watershed. That's our goal. And we are working through companies to achieve this goal. Of course, for the company, we are providing work with their suppliers, like cleaning, we mainly like improving efficiency inside of the supply chain, and like exchanging learnings between facilities. But for us, this is a project of like, we want to have this watershed healthy. And there are ways to improve it. So for now, we're just working with the textile sector. But there are many other actors in that basin that we are starting to try to engage to help us to even advance what we are doing. So there is limitations. If you're just working with one sector, there are other sectors in that basin that may be having an impact that we cannot address right now. So we start like working with one sector, and our goal is to engage even others, and maybe other NGOs, why not, that can work in other areas that we don't have capacity or we don't have time. And one of the things that we see talking about healthy watersheds is that in many cases, we have a big, huge gap. And it's the gap like knowing what are the risks that we have in that basin. Meaning that when we start working in the Noyal Bhavani, there was no hydrogeological monitoring there. We didn't know where were the pollution hotspots. There was a lack of knowledge, and now we have this information, and we would be able to share, but how to share, where to share. And the same when we go to other basins, maybe this information is already available with other NGOs, but how can we just not continue, duplicating efforts? How can we work together and share this information in a way that we can really promote the health and see through time how this river basin is changing? Because that's also important. And with the advance of technology, we could see the impact of our projects 20 years ago. So we started 20 years ago working in Cotomina region to improve best practices. Is that having an impact on the watershed? How? We could look at that through Earth observation, for example. But it's expensive, and we need to see, we need to find a way to work together towards having this cumulative, this joint effort towards managing the watershed.
And Angela, I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, talking about monitoring and evaluation and the role of digital technologies in delivering that, not just data, but actionable information that is essentially democratized to all stakeholders within a watershed. And Andre, I want to turn to you, because in your narrative, you actually refer to healthy watersheds, and you come at it directly. And you and I have had this conversation that ABInBev wants to be a brand that communities and other stakeholders want in their community, and what that means. And for me, that was a very elegant way to frame the value proposition of your water stewardship and sustainability strategy. So could you talk a little bit about, your thinking around healthy watersheds and how you came to the language that you did.
I will. Yeah. So for us, bringing the focus on healthy watersheds was helping evolve the water stewardship narrative beyond companies doing projects and rather focusing on, so what is the ultimate outcome? Because we found that a number of companies and sometimes ourselves could be tempted to focus projects on ourselves and say, how much water are we going to offset or how much water are we going to recharge? And in the end, that's not the issue. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but you have to focus on watershed health for yourself as a company and also those around you. So for us, the idea of watershed health and a functioning watershed goes together with the measurable impact. So again, going beyond, hey, we sponsored a project or we were involved or we contributed some capabilities, it's having a measurable impact. So the first case, what is the measure, showing that our impact of the watershed projects have a measurable impact on either the quality or the availability of water, depending on what the challenges is, or both, which is essential. But also eventually building up to actually watershed health. So we know as companies, we typically are quite small consumers of overall water in a watershed, but it's important that we map our contribution to the overall watershed health. So even if you're only a very small part of a bigger problem and a bigger solution, that you can show the contribution that you're making, that you're making the right contribution, not something that, hey, this is a nice project we can easily do, but what is the challenge in that watershed? If that is that there is too much suspended solids in the surface water, then your project needs to contribute to that. And rather than say, hey, look, we've got a borehole here, this is brilliant, and can we give free water? That's not the issue.
I love that you're thinking about this more than just counting gallons and liters, by the way, which is going to be a segue into talking to David about how they frame that positive. But, really, why? What is the end goal here in terms of being a key stakeholder in creating healthy watersheds and ensuring that they're sustained over some period of time, as opposed to a series of performance metrics, ultimately.
You hinted at, can I just touch on that? You hinted that in your introduction, that we know through climate change and demographic change and economic growth that water is becoming scarce in a number of places where we operate. And in order to make sure that we are a welcome local citizen over the next few decades, you want to make sure that people are grateful that you operate there because you make a positive contribution to the watershed, rather than, oh no, here's another beer company who wants to operate in our community. Obviously, people then have the impression that you may be using the water or all of the water. So it's very important, if you want to have a license to operate and make sure that the watershed is actually healthy enough to sustain you and the communities into the future, that you focus on watershed health.
That's really important. And we're going to get to it shortly in terms of the only way you can build and ensure you maintain a healthy watershed is with digital technologies, or else it's subjective, it's stuck in analog data collection and analytics, and we're not that we're running out of time, we've run out of time in terms of really understanding what's happening and the ability to translate all of this into actionable information. David, you talk about net positive, and that's how you frame your water stewardship program. And I know in my conversations with you, there's the volumetric side, there's the non-volumetric side, and in a lot of ways you track in a fairly similar manner how Angela framed it, and also what Andre has built with ABInBev. But could you talk a little bit about your thinking around healthy watersheds within the context of a net positive strategy and what you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Will, and thank you for the invitation to talk. It's a very opportune time for the subject. So, and Andre kind of briefly touched on it in his last comment. From a PepsiCo point of view, the net water positive messaging is really in terms of how do we make a contribution to our local watershed that far exceeds the impact we have as a company. And again, as Andre mentioned, most companies are relatively small consumers in watersheds. but we still need to recognize that we need to make a contribution as PepsiCo, and we need to make a contribution that's far larger than our impact, because it's just the time to do it. We need to get that momentum going. We can't wait for others to necessarily join right now. So we need to push that agenda hard and fast. And you know, from our view of a healthy watershed is, you know, oftentimes we talk about a watershed as something out there. It's something that we need to do. But, you know, we all live in watersheds. We operate in watersheds. It's part of us. And we rely on watersheds, you know, from a company point of view. We can't do anything with water in terms of producing our products. We need water for agriculture. More importantly, our surrounding communities need water. And, you know, we also rely on healthy watersheds for those ecosystem services that we rely on, which are often massively undervalued. And, you know, in order for that to happen, we need watersheds to function. And in order to function, they need to be healthy, for want of a better expression. And, you know, it's one thing putting money into a project and saying, great, you know, we'll invest in this project and hopefully it's making an impact. But, you know, we need to understand what's going on in terms of are the kind of projects we're investing in making a difference? Are they having an impact? Because if they're not, to Andre's earlier point, then why are we doing it? So there's a strong focus for us in terms of really understanding how the kind of projects we are investing in are helping improve the general health of these watersheds.
David, thank you. And that's a good segue into, you know, really two things. So can you make this come to life in terms of, okay, what are the programs? What are the projects that you have initiated to build and maintain those healthy watersheds? And then we'll segue into, well, how do you measure that every dollar, euro, whatever has a positive impact? And not that it's just a financial transaction, but, you know, Andre, to your point, you're placing the right bets. You're really pulling the right levers within a watershed as a key stakeholder. So can the three of you talk just a little bit about some of the programs that you're thinking about, projects and so on? And Angela, I'll go back to you if you can talk about WWF's take on your interventions with multinationals and what you're investing in, essentially.
Okay, thank you. So I just mentioned before the project in India, and when it comes to understanding the watershed and investing, we have a lot of faith, and we have a lot of responsibility as well when it comes to collective action. We engage local stakeholders. We have a project. Then again, there's another example from the textile sector in Turkey that we started working in the basin. It's the Buyuk Menderes, and in that basin we have the manufacture of the textile, and that's where we started. We started like trying to reduce the pollution from the manufacturing. But then downstream in that same basin, we had cotton production. And we said, okay, we cannot solve the problem within this basin if we don't tackle cotton production. It's using water, it's supporting the salinization of soil, it's using lots of pesticides. So we start working with cotton. But then we realized, okay, yeah, let's add also this landscape approach. So that was a project that started from one small piece and it started growing to really cover the whole watershed and the impact. Now in that project, for example, we are having you're going to have a small part that is going to be to protect the European eel, which is a freshwater species. And as you probably know, freshwater species are the ones that have declined most in the last 30 years. So we need really to understand from the community perspective also what are their needs. In WWF, we use the basin report cards. That's how we call it. So basin health report cards is a methodology that we use to understand what are the physical parameters we should be looking at in that specific basin, or and continuing to look at the physical, the social parameters and the economic parameters. So we use different tools. The water risk filter that you're probably aware as well is something that we use to then activate collective action. For example, within the textile sector, there is this open platform called the Open Apparel Registry, where we have we can map. There is the map of the suppliers. If we understand that many companies have their suppliers in a basin that is a basin of interest for WWF, we know who we should be talking to interfere in that basin and to start a collective action project. So that's the direction we go. We try to work, as I said before, in basket funds. So we don't have one project with one company pushing for their own indicators, but we try to work in a way that we have the goals for that basin all in only one project. And if you want to contribute, you contribute to that basket, and then we implement the project in the basin. And then the results, let's say, the results is not from one brand only, but it's from the collective work, is everyone working together.
So yes. Angela, I'm confident you're going to get some questions about the basin health report cards a little bit later, because that seems to be, again, an important tool in its own right, but also how do we take digital technologies and really sort of punch up and add to what you've done with a watershed health report card. So we'll come back to that. David, can you talk a little bit about some of the programs and projects that you're investing in? And what I'd like to hear from both you and Andre is, without naming names, what's going right, what's going wrong, what do you need as a segue into the last few minutes of this panel, which is, okay, well, what do we need for M&E? How can we do better in terms of applying digital technologies so we really can quantify the positive impact and outcomes? So take it away, David.
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, we've invested in around 33 water partnerships globally. And the type of projects that we invest in kind of really reflects the richness and the diversity of the type of watersheds we operate in. Each is so unique, and that varies anything from working with farmers to improve irrigation efficiency, or looking at alternative crop production, through to forestry, and through to things like invasive species removal. Great project that comes to mind straight away, and something that ABInBev is involved in as well, is in Cape Town. So we've got the Cape Town Water Fund that we invest in with the Nature Conservancy, and it's really targeted at removing a mass amount of invasive species, which both suck up a lot of water, but also have a really big impact on local diversity, ecosystem diversity. So, through this project, and WWF's involved as well, they've cleared around 19,000 hectares of water, put back around 8.9 billion litres of water. But also importantly, there's really important social and ecological impact. So creating jobs through this program, so around 290 jobs have been created. Half of those have been allocated to disadvantaged women. But also interesting from the ecological side, I actually last week I was looking at some footage from camera traps they put up in that area that they've cleared. And things like leopard and antelope and porcupines, which weren't really in that area before, are now starting to come back because the local vegetation is being restored and that natural habitat has been restored. So it's really, really impressive to see how these things are getting off the ground and really starting to deliver in terms of results. In terms of what's going right, what's going wrong, I think the usual two things I'd say. The usual issue is conversations around scale, right? And we've been talking about this probably for the last 10 years or so, and still I don't think have got it right. And I think fundamentally the model is not working. When each company brings a certain amount of money, and you're working with one or two NGOs, but they also need to protect their income streams. And essentially, we need to deconstruct this model and kind of think, how do we relook at this in order to get the sort of funding that we need to get these some of these watershed programs at a scale that actually starts delivering results and making a difference where we need it. The second point I'd make is which is kind of leading to the subject around is around data availability. We've been trying to, or not trying to, we're busy piloting the new science-based targets methodology for water in Turkey. And it's just incredible how little data is available. And sometimes what data is available, last measured back in the 1970s. So on the one hand, you're really trying to see how we can make sure that the programs we're putting in are addressing the problem. But on the other hand, the sort of data we need to inform those programs is just not there, or so outdated they can't be relied on. So I think there's a big data gap over there. The third thing, sorry, that I'll quickly add in terms of, which I forgot about, in terms of partnerships that we're looking at, and one that you're involved in with Will is the Colorado River Basin Fund, which is really taking a different angle in terms of how we address water stress and water scarcity, in terms of how do we invest in new innovative technologies and startups who can help us solve these problems on the ground, other than the usual actors like NGOs and companies. So I think there's a great opportunity there as well in terms of how do we address water risk.
And David, I'll take it as a compliment that you referred to me as not a usual actor. Certainly not a good actor, and certainly not unusual. So that's great. And obviously I'm biased, but the ability for a multinational to make investments in innovative technology companies, in particular digital, will get us to a better place faster. Andre, so similar question, what are the challenges? And I want to use you as a segue into the sort of closing discussion around what do we need in the way of digital technologies? And it sort of goes back to what Angela and David were talking about in terms of, science-based targets, but if there are no data, then we have a problem. So can you talk a little bit about your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think David covered a nice range of types of projects. I'll try to bring a slightly different example. So an important area for us is Lima in Peru, and face quite strong pressure on water availability in the area. And really exciting project is restoring the ancient channels called amunas in the area that were really constructed hundreds of years ago by indigenous communities to channel the water down the mountains. And restoring them helps in a number of ways. Obviously, you can collect the water at the end, at the bottom, and that helps with the dry season. But two contributions are much more important. The one is actually making sure that the water infiltrates back into the aquifer during this process down the mountain. And then secondly, also that you stop the sedimentation of the runoff where the water is running down the mountain. But now you have a really exciting project, but how do you know that it's successful? And that's touching with you on the technology. So I can show you beautiful pictures, local people working, constructing, and once you can see what they look like before and what they look like after, and you can physically see the water. But how do you map that? So for us, it's very basic technology in terms of real-time measurement with hydrometric stations, looking at radar sensors to look at the flow of water so you can understand both in the wet and the dry season how the water flows and infiltrates. We're currently experimenting with fluorescent tracers that you can eventually, hopefully with optical sensors, show and better understand how does the water actually flow and infiltrate from the top to the bottom, that you can maximize your impact. So we are really excited about this. It takes our project, it leaps forward in terms of better management and understanding of the impact. But of course, it's still one project. The challenge is how do you connect this with the overall watershed health, etc. So we're very aware of the limitations, but we're also really excited about the potential and what we're learning here in order to apply it in other places.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. I want to ask one quick question. So keep it to a sentence or two in terms of what you're thinking. What's the call to action to the panelists that we've assembled here and the participants in terms of how do we do better by leveraging digital technologies to create and sustain those healthy watersheds. So just real quick, and we have a couple of questions that have been presented. So I want to just save a few minutes for those.
Well,
So what's your, hey, Angela, what's your ask? What do you want?
Thinking, well, installing a technology, there are many technologies available. We need to understand long-term monitoring. How can we actually have financial models that support long-term monitoring outside of a project? We need to start thinking like Andres said, at the watershed level. Do we need a financial model that is going to leverage funds and then is going to be used to monitor the whole watershed, so we can really identify where the area that's most impacted that we should be acting? So like financial models and thinking about the watershed holistically, outside projects, outside logos, or outside brands of companies, you know, like watershed per se. That's my one long sentence.
That works, Angela, thanks. David, and then Andre, then I'll do the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, there's a lot of data out there. The question is how accessible it is. You know, a lot of this data requires specialist skills to interpret, and you know, how do we democratize it? And I use that word very guardedly because I know it can be abused a lot. You know, how can local communities access data that's usable to them and they can make informed decisions around? Because WWF water is filter, the aqueduct, all that's great for macro view, but local data is really important. Sometimes that local data is just not accessible. So we need to think about that.
David, thank you. Andre.
Yeah, well, forgive me if I say the same thing that I've said in about the last 10 years on every single panel that I've been on. It's collective action. We really just have to scale up and stop doing the same thing. So you could have just taped it and replayed it. But I'll make it slightly more interesting and saying, well, if we're talking about it, I'm going to challenge WWF and PepsiCo and ABInBev. So the next time we're together on a panel, we must be able to show a project where we are collectively involved, all three of us. And there's digital technology to show progress.
Okay, so Tom and I will hold the three of you to this, by the way, and you will get a calendar. What's that?
I said accepted. Challenge
All right.
accepted.
All right, we're going to send out a calendar invite. So, you know, there's going to be a stake in the ground. And we've got time for one question. Jim Waria, his question is, can you address how you are influencing supply partners to reduce fertilizer use that contributes to nitrous oxide release, nitrates into groundwater and nutrients, creating toxic algal blooms? And we've got 2 minutes. So perhaps one of you can raise your hand and tackle that one. Andre, man, you're signing up for everything today.
Yeah, sorry, this is passion with me. Certainly for us, working with farmers in terms of soil health, which is the key outcome that we want, that includes soil moisture, of course, and optimizing for fertilizer management is just critical. It's a key part of our regenerative agriculture approach, the better use of fertilizer and being able to measure and manage the infiltration of chemicals back into the water system.
Great. And by the way, there have been a number of comments that they love the challenge. So you've now built momentum and an audience that has a expectation here. So I'm just going to take a minute and thank the three of you for really an informative, lively discussion and a call to action and a stake in the ground. And I would say that more often than not, we're all on panels and it's a great conversation, but no call to action. So thanks for stepping up to that, and we'll make it happen. So thank you, three of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.